Welcome to the Cybertraps podcast. I am Jethro Jones coming to you this week from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I am the host of the podcast Transformative Principal, author of the books School X and How to Be a Transformative Principal. And I am a former principal at all levels of K-12 education.
Greetings, everybody. I'm Frederick Lane, an author, attorney, and educational consultant based in Brooklyn, New York. And this will be my last Brooklyn broadcast for a few weeks, but we'll talk more about that later. I am the author of 10 books, including most recently Cybertraps for Educators 2.0, Raising Cyber-Ethical Kids, and Cybertraps for Expecting Moms and Dads. Jethro and I have teamed up to bring timely, entertaining, and useful information to teachers, parents, and others about the risks arising from the use and misuse of digital devices.
Over the coming weeks and months, we'll be talking to some of the world's leading experts from the fields of education, parenting, sociology, and cyber safety. Join us as we look at what it takes to better navigate our increasingly high-tech world. For more information or to donate to our work, please visit centerforcyberethics.org.
The Cybertraps podcast is a production of the Center for Cyber Ethics, a 501c3 independent, nonpartisan educational institute dedicated to the study and promotion of cyber ethics as a positive social force through research, curricula development, publishing and media, professional training, and public advocacy. And you know, Jethro, greetings to you on your far-flung trip, but it's very exciting because it looks like we're going to have a chance to apply for some incubator money with the Brooklyn Public Library, and it looks like it could be a really good fit for the center. So we're off to a good start, I hope.
Yeah, very good. There's all kinds of opportunities. I wore my Center for Cyber Ethics shirt in the airplane today and, walked around with my shirt showing our insignia. And so, nobody talked to me because we don't do that anymore. Everybody's got their headphones on and we're focused. But hopefully somebody saw it and thought, maybe I should look into that and check things out. So that'll be fun.
That's really terrific. Well, certainly we will need to make it a standard part of our podcast that if anybody is aware of grant or funding programs that they think might be useful for this work, they should definitely let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do reach out to us. Either one of us, centerforcyberethics.org there's a contact form and you can get in touch with us there. So let's talk about our topic today, which is a bit of a bummer. I hate to talk about negative stuff, but I think it's important. We're talking about the Uvalde shooting and whether or not social media monitoring could have prevented it. So what else would you like to add here in the introduction, Fred?
It's always a tough topic, and I felt bad as I started to put these notes together. But of course, I'm trying to grab the material that I think will be most useful to our listeners and of the most interest to people who work in this area. And for us, Jethro, as people who've been involved in education and with our tech focus, the obvious question is, what role does social media play in these kinds of events? And does it provide educators or law enforcement the opportunity to intervene before something happens? And unfortunately, we're developing a pool of data to answer those questions, and the answers are not necessarily satisfying. So in this particular case, in the aftermath of the attack, it's Uvalde, right? Because you actually live out generally in that area.
Yes, generally in that area. I'm in the Northwest, which is almost as far away from Uvalde as you are in New York. Maybe not.
Well, just shows you how big the West is. But in any case, this particular incident, like so many others, had some precursors on social media that the individual who committed the attack on the school had posted photos of firearms as part of his social media feed, had made some increasingly specific threats, and had really basically promised that he was going to do this to a young woman that he was speaking to just a few hours before the attack occurred. And when these things happen, you get a lot of people, including, I have to say it, some grandstanding politicians who immediately turn to social media and say, why didn't you prevent this? And I offer as Exhibit A on that, Jethro, the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, who has been jumping up and down on this soapbox. And one of the things I want us to do today is to help people understand the different kinds of channels that are out there and the challenges that they present in terms of investigation and in terms of prevention, because it's very simple to say, well, this stuff is on a computer somewhere, law enforcement should see it and it should be stopped. But when you dig down into how the technology works, it's not that simple. And of course, there's constitutional issues on top of everything else.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to start, because we don't want everything that we post to be monitored by law enforcement just in case we say or do something that could be perceived as negative. Like, think about the movie Minority Report, right? Where there's a whole division of thought crime where if you think it, then you have essentially already done it. And that is not the kind of system that I want to live in, because I have plenty of bad thoughts that I would never act on, and we all do. And so
yes, we do.
we do not want that to be the norm. We don't want that to be the focus. And so what we often say to people is, be aware what you post, because somebody is always watching. And once you post it online, like, it doesn't go away. So somebody can screenshot it, record it, share it, and go on from there. However, we don't want the authorities to be constantly monitoring everything that we're doing, just in case we might do something inappropriate and then come and bust us for it, right?
Well, exactly. And for reasons both intellectual and bleak, I have been rereading George Orwell's 1984. And I mean, it's just an amazing book. And if there's anyone listening who hasn't read it, you absolutely have to read this book, because it is amazing how much Orwell foresaw in, what was it, the early 1950s, the late 1940s, when he wrote this book.
Yeah.
And one of the things you're introduced to at the very beginning of the book is the screen that is installed in every home of a member of the party. And he obviously is riffing a little bit on Soviet Union and so forth. But these screens are set up in such a way that they can see and hear everything in the apartment in which Winston Smith, the protagonist, lives. And he doesn't know whether or not somebody is actually watching at any given moment. So precisely to your point, you have to regulate your behavior on the assumption that you're always being watched.
Yeah. So shortly after his name was released, somebody found his social media profile, his Instagram profile to be specific. Yeah. But he had other social media profiles, like Yubo, I believe is what he was using to chat with somebody. I'd never even heard of that one before.
Yeah, but same here. Yeah.
Yeah. As other software, social media companies or online companies create messaging tools, all of those things become social media platforms, basically, that allow you to communicate across great distances with people in near real time. And that really complicates things as well. So somebody found his...
I'm sorry, let me just, there's one detail there. I mean, just by way of example, the young woman that he was messaging with on Yubo lived in Germany.
Right.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, he's striking up a friendship with someone across the Atlantic and confiding in her. And what she's supposed to do, who does she contact, if she's concerned? Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because that's the point that I was going to make, is this guy did not have 2.5 million followers on Instagram. And I didn't see the screenshot of his profile that showed how many followers he had, but probably not a ton, right? And so of those who saw it, including this girl he chatted with on Yubo, what can they do about it when they see these kinds of posts coming across? They can get in contact with the authorities. They can get in contact with somebody that they know who could be in the same area. I mean, the thing is, though, is that it's really difficult to say, just because somebody posted something that you might think is inappropriate or scary doesn't necessarily mean that they are planning to do something horrific, right? And so you have to, the recipient or the viewer has to judge whether or not that warrants a report to somebody to say, better go check this kid out and see what's really going on. And that's an exceptionally hard thing for especially a teenager to recognize what is serious, what is not serious, what's said in jest, what's said in a threatening manner. And it's really a difficult thing to be able to understand. But the fact of the matter is, there are still clues that everybody after a tragedy like this wants to know why something more wasn't done.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that what you're putting your finger on, Jethro, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is given the fragmented nature, right, of law enforcement in the United States, and given the distances that these messages can travel, let's say you're some kid in South Carolina and you see a message that you may think originated in Arizona or it could be New Mexico. You probably don't know the West that well, so you're not really sure where it is, right? But the kid's making let's just assume a credible, or not, maybe not credible, but a specific enough threat that you, as a decent 15-year-old, are worried, that someone might get hurt. So who do you go to? Like, how are the South Carolina police going to respond to that, or some local sheriff, or even your school principal? And one of the real challenges that you and I have talked about and are confronting is the lack of centralization. But at the same time, you don't want to centralize surveillance of social media.
Yeah. So the other wrinkle to that is that if I get a threat from someone, I have no idea who they are. I honestly, as a principal, don't take that as seriously as a threat from someone that I know within my community, right? And so
Sure.
That, however, doesn't mean that I wouldn't do something about it. I would find the student in question as a principal and at the very least, put eyes on him that day and to ask myself, what do I see here? Do I see someone who looks like they are like planning something? And like, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a profiler, don't get me wrong. It's just like checking out the situation and saying, is this worthwhile? Now, the other side of this is that we've talked about on here, the idea of swatting, that you send the SWAT team to somebody's house to bully or punish them or whatever the case may be under false pretenses that are not true. And so because of that negative behavior, you also can't overreact to all of these things that could come in. And we have no idea how much that stuff comes in. But I will say, as a principal, I got plenty of false accusations that had no merit at all, but I still needed to do something to make sure that people were safe.
Right, because the downside of one mistake is so terrible that you can't. Right. I mean, it's just the potential consequence is so vast. Well, look, Jethro, as I was researching after the Uvalde shooting, the number of false reports around the country absolutely exploded. And if that's not sort of a sign of societal mental illness, I don't know what there would be, because it's just tragic that people would take this event and compound it by stirring up fear and anxiety and all the rest of that in communities elsewhere, in the country. Yeah, I don't understand it.
I don't understand that either. And especially one of the things that I found really disturbing was that he said, I'm going to go shoot up an elementary school. And I saw other reports of other people saying something similar. Like, I don't understand how that is something that one would do, two would brag about, and three would premeditate. Like, okay, good talking to you. Now I'm going to go do this. It just does not make any sense.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. And that becomes, one of the many contributing factors to this, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we can look at a whole constellation of things that led to this event, and mental health is absolutely part of it. Certainly, the ease with which this individual got his hands on a gun is staggering all by itself. And then, of course, there's the social media piece. I think what is important for people to understand, though, is the way in which social media is changing. And by social media, I think we can take your broader definition of any app really that has communicative capabilities. Because that's really, I mean, that's all you need for social in this context. You and I are being social right now. It's not in the sense of Facebook or YouTube. But the point is that so many of these services now are by default building in encryption in the communication tools themselves, which basically means that it's that much more difficult for law enforcement to see what's going on, even if they are investigating. And then related to that, and this is something that arises with respect to services, for instance, like Discord, where people are effectively running their own server within the Discord service. These individuals are determining who can see the content that they create, right? So with respect to, I don't know if it was this incident or actually, I think it was the Buffalo assault, the individual had created a whole bunch of materials that he stored on Discord. And unlike Facebook and Instagram and some of these others, Twitter, of course, which use the algorithms to maximize the audience for a particular piece of content, something like Discord is the reverse of that, where it's giving the user the capability to determine who gets to see it. And that's why it can be so difficult to investigate these cases before something happens.
Yeah. And I think you found that there was already some security tech involved in Uvalde that you've seen your research. Tell us about that, because I think that is really fascinating too.
Well, that was one of the lines in the newsletter that I published just after the Uvalde case. And just as a shout out, if people want to keep track of the work that you and I are doing, newsletter.cybertraps.com is a great place to see what we're doing. But I mentioned in that last newsletter that schools that are paying for this kind of social media monitoring service really should step back and take a look at whether or not there's a good return on the investment. So in Uvalde, for instance, they had two pieces of security tech in place. One was called Raptor, Raptor Technologies, which is a piece of ed tech used to monitor visitors coming in and out of the school, which obviously did no good whatsoever in this particular event. And then they use a program called Social Sentinel, which is designed to scan public-facing social media posts for things that might be triggers or red flags for some of these events. And there are a whole bunch of different competitors for Social Sentinel, but the underlying concept is pretty straightforward. You've got a bunch of keywords. You run scans on vast quantities of social media content. And if something trips the wire, then the organization reaches out to the school. Two issues really immediately pop up. If we're talking only about public facing, that wipes out Snapchat. It wipes out all of the stuff with, not all of Snapchat, but a good chunk of it. It wipes out direct messaging. It wipes out Discord. All of these places now where kids are putting content because they want more control over who sees what they see. So that's number one. And then number two, the challenge is, can this discovery and warning process be fast enough?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the question. So in going back to the example from Minority Report, the thought police, like these beings that could sense what people were thinking and kind of predict the future, they would be able to say, like, this is going to happen in this many minutes. And, you know, you could deploy the task force to go take care of that. But that, you know, he did not say in a public forum, I'm going to use this gun to go shoot up an elementary school. And that is, so therefore, like, you can't say that just because somebody posts images of a gun, that that's what they're going to do. Now, we can see correlation between people who have shot up schools that they did post those things.
Right.
But there's a lot of kids who are interested in guns for completely non-nefarious purposes and are fascinated by that idea. And certainly our media, portrays guns in a powerful way that says these are huge weapons of destruction that you can do something with, and glamorizes it in many movies. And I think that all of these things combining just makes it really difficult to say, like, here's the thing that tells us that this is what he was going to do.
It's extraordinarily difficult. I mean, just in listening to you describe it, it's hard not to have sort of a sense of despair about how complicated all of this is. And we haven't even really begun to talk about the amplifying effect of social media, right? I mean, one of the things that's particularly horrifying is the fact that some individuals view this in a scorecard way. That there's an extremely small, fortunately, subset of this community that is actually looking at who's going to be the most effective, that is to say, create the most carnage. And you wouldn't have had that without 4chan or without Facebook, without whatever, whichever services, Discord, feed into that sense of competition and chaos. And that's one of the things that underscores for me how multifaceted the solution has to be. And I guess in practical terms for schools, because I do want to make sure that we don't leave people just banging their heads against the wall. What schools can and should do is always an interesting question. I do think every school system should take a long, hard look at any social monitoring program to really think through whether the program is actually going to help with the specific problem we're dealing with. And along those lines, I think one of the things we should talk about are some of the possible detriments of having too much surveillance material or surveillance technology in a school. So that's number one. The other thing I think that is important, and it doesn't exactly answer the situation if you've got someone coming from outside the community, but we have talked a lot about the culture of cyber safety, this idea of creating an environment in which individual members of the school community are watchful and informed about what's going on. Like you said, I thought it was a really great way to phrase it, that you want to get eyes on somebody that you may have concerns about, because you're going to know that individual and be in a position to help assess what their mental state is.
Yeah, and that's really important, because you can prevent a lot just by being present. And that's where so I had a student who had some severe mental disabilities, and he would threaten to blow up the school and shoot the school all the time. And there was no way that he could possibly do that. And so every time he said something like that, we would have to call his parents and say, he made a threat today. Do you have any weapons? Do you have anything that he could do to actually do this? And we would just stay in contact with them. And they would say, no, we don't have any guns. We don't have anything that he could use to make an explosive. There is nothing like that in our home. But we still, followed up and chatted about that. Now, because of his disability, this was an aspect of his disability, and he just could not handle not making threats. It was too much. Now, that compared with somebody where they actually could do that or have the means, you definitely have to approach that very differently. And this is, maybe a little bit off tangent, but expelling a student from school for when they do have access gets them off of your radar and makes it harder to know when they are doing those things. And this is part of what is challenging about the system. Is this kid was 18, I believe he was a senior at the high school, last I understood, but he wasn't going to school and wasn't participating in the educational process. from what I understand. I don't know the truth of that. But if he's not participating in the school and what's going on, then there's no way to know what his mental state is and what his capabilities are. And that is a dangerous place to be, because then you can be surprised. And if he's going to school every day, you know what's going on, you could talk to him and say, hey, have you gotten a gun recently? We saw these pictures on social media. And you could actually have a conversation with him and see what's going on. And if you fear that he could do something, then you could take action to prevent that from happening.
That's an amazing thing, Jethro, to think of you and other educators having to have those conversations, though.
Yeah, and it's not fair. Like, it shouldn't be happening. But at the same time, you know, we as educators recognize that we are part of a community in helping parents raise these kids. And so we need to take steps that may be difficult for parents to take. And sometimes that means having hard conversations with parents and with students about potential threats that either of them are making or doing, and things that could be pushing them to do things that they would later regret.
Well, this is where we get into that broader concept, right, of the culture of cyber safety, because it's not just the frontline educators like yourself. It's everybody who's involved in the school community, from you all the way through the staff to the parents to the kids themselves. And that seems to me to be an important first step, that is something concrete schools can do to really elevate the importance of talking about these issues and helping people to understand the role that they can play in keeping everyone safe. And you do wonder whether or not this particular individual had people who knew him in the high school who may not have been social media friends, but may have seen behaviors that should have raised some potential concerns. I mean, obviously, this is all speculative, but I think that there's a lot of different aspects here that schools can focus on. We've certainly talked about digital citizenship from kindergarten forward, helping kids to understand what their responsibilities are online. I think all of that can be helpful in these kinds of situations. In terms of the surveillance tech itself, a couple of things that I did want to mention as we kind of begin to wrap this up, that first of all, if you take a look at some of the resources that I compiled for the show notes, one of the things that I found interesting was that people have been doing a fair amount of research with respect to surveillance technology. And we really don't have any good evidence that it actually works yet. So that's the first thing. This is why we get back to that budget item. As a former, finance chair, I'm always on top of that. So if it's not actually going to produce the results you want, then the question becomes, are there other costs that you should be aware of? And people raise these concerns. And again, we're all debating the different aspects here. But for instance, there's some concern that surveillance technology, whether you're dealing with social media monitoring or facial recognition, may have built-in biases with respect to profiling. That's an issue. More than anything else, and we alluded to this with the Orwell 1984, if you're sending kids to a place where they are always under surveillance and they know that, you're really conditioning them to accept surveillance, which is not something we should want our children to be comfortable with. They should question the need for surveillance. And I realize that's not necessarily the outcome a more authoritarian government is looking for. But I defend strongly the idea that kids should not constantly feel that they're being watched in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the more that we do that in schools, the more they feel like that's what they're doing is being surveilled, and we're conditioning them to think that is okay. And the other aspect of that is that if we assume the worst about our kids coming to school every day, then they one may start living up to those poor expectations, right, which is no fun, which I've experienced also. But the other thing is that we do things that make school feel like it is a place where you are not wanted, where you're not trusted. And so, the adage of, if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide, cuts both ways, right? If if you're surveilling me, you must think that I'm doing something wrong. Therefore, why should I make good choices if you already think that I'm making bad choices?
See, that's a very subtle point. I like that a lot.
And one that teenagers especially pick up on very, very easily, because
yes, they do.
they think, if you don't trust me, then I'm not going to pretend, and I'm just going to do all the worst things because you expect it of me anyway.
Right.
And so we don't want to do things that make schools feel like prisons. We don't want to do things that make schools feel like you are not welcome or trusted or cared about here. We need to do things that increase connection, that increase people looking out for each other in a healthy, positive way, and not things that decrease that. And unfortunately, with social media, I believe that even though we are digitally connected, we are emotionally more disconnected than we ever have been before. And it seems to be just going worse and worse.
Well, and that is exactly the work we're doing, because I think there are also ethical divisions that are arising with respect to all of this. And so that's our fight. That's what we're here.
Right.
Look, one of probably the last point with respect to surveillance tech that I'll raise, because I think is an important one, is this idea of mission creep, right? You know, the old saying that if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if a school district is spending X tens of thousands of dollars on surveillance technology, they're going to want to get some results from it. And so one of the things that people have been monitoring and seeing is this idea that more and more minor infractions get punished because you got to show that you're using it for something. And I think that this creates that sort of prison environment that you were referencing. And not surprisingly, there's some beginning evidence that this kind of surveillance technology actually lowers student performances in schools that use it. Because, of course, the kids are distracted. They're worried about this other stuff. It creates hostility and suspicion. Who can learn under those circumstances, or at least learn well?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think the other aspect of that is that when kids feel like they're being watched, then they try to do what the observer wants them to do. And it's hard to tell sometimes what exactly that is. And I think, for example, I'm vehemently opposed to things like turnitin.com, where you check for plagiarism. And the reality is that if you are assigning something that can be plagiarized, and then that's your problem as the teacher, that is not the student's problem. And so you need to do a better job of assigning whatever it is that you're assigning to make sure that it's not plagiarizable. And if it is, then you need to teach kids how to not plagiarize. And that's an important role. And all these things that use AI and technology to make it easier to catch people doing wrong are all created, in my mind, for the wrong purpose. That you're trying to catch someone doing something wrong instead of using it to help you do whatever it is you're trying to do better. And that's not the right foot to start out on. And so it leads to all these things about distrust and you don't believe in me and you don't value me. All those things come, and that decreases connection, and the connection is what is going to prevent these things from happening in the future.
Excellent. Very well said. Well, let me close up then with a couple of reminders for people. As I said, we've got our usual array of resources in the show notes. We do want to give a particular shout out to one of probably our most common guest, most frequent guest, Dr. Glenn Lipson, who's a forensic psychologist out in California. And if you go through our show archives on cybertraps.com, he's done 2 or 3 interviews with us on these kinds of issues and some of the challenges of identifying people who might pose problems within the schools. I will put some specific links in the show notes because we won't publish this for a day or so. So that'll give me some time to add some material, and then people can go and listen directly to what Dr. Lipson has to say.
Yeah, very good. Great stuff. Dr. Lipson's awesome.
he's really been a good guy. All righty, Jethro, I know you've got schmoozing to do, so we will wrap up our episode today. In the coming weeks, we will continue the coverage of the Cybertraps podcast for emerging trends in a variety of areas, including digital misconduct, cyber safety, cybersecurity, privacy, and the challenges of high-tech parenting. Along the way, we'll talk to a growing collection of international experts who are helping us to understand the risks and the rewards of digital technology.
You can find the Cybertraps podcast on all of your favorite podcast apps. We'd love it if you would reach out to us if you have questions or topic or guest suggestions. And if you're still listening, you must have loved this conversation. If so, please leave us a 5-star rating in your podcast service. We appreciate you being here and look forward to seeing you next week on the Cybertraps podcast.